Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, and welcome here to Derrynane House. This is, for those of you who don't know, this is my second parish. I was born in Carsaveen, but my mother and my mother's people come from here, so I feel I have a foot on both sides of the mountain. So it's great to be back here in Cardaniel. I'm just two things. First of all, I hope you enjoyed today's proceedings. Secondly, I'd like also to remember that there are people listening to us in the AV room and in the marquee, and just to say that you will not be forgotten during the course of the day's proceedings. We have roving mics, so for those of you who want to ask questions of the lecturers, there will be a facility for you to do that. So just to kind of make that point. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ruth Barrington, who also has two addresses, by the way. One in Dublin, one here in Castlecove, a long-time visitor and resident here of Caherdaniel and Castlecove. Most of you know her, I'm sure. She will moderate the first session, so I leave all that to Ruth. But before proceeding with the first session, I'd like to introduce Adrian Corcoran, who is the Chief Supervising Guide with responsibilities over Derrynane, Garnish, Rosscastle, Skellig Maheel and Ardfert. So you can see he's a man of a lot of responsibilities. But I do want to underline that despite all of these, he's always made great time for us, as indeed has had the OPW since we started here in year one. And I'd like really to acknowledge that. They really pushed the boat out for us. I want to thank Adrian, thank Chris O'Neill and the Office of Public Works for doing that. And I'm going to stop talking because Ruth, I know, wants to get ahead with proceedings, so let me introduce Adrian to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice. Good morning. First of all, on behalf of the Office of Public Works, I'd like to welcome you to Derrynane House. This is one of a number of high-profile events we've had this season. Between government meetings, royal visits, poetry, we've had music in the house, and probably more to come yet. And it's nice to see some familiar faces back again for this summer school. I know this is the second day, and there's some really interesting papers which relate to Daniel. And each year we learn a lot more about Daniel, his life, and his connections through the summer school. But just a few housekeeping items first. I would ask people just turn off your mobile phone, or iPhones at the moment. During the day, we have stewards, we have guides here on site. Now, they're here to help with the smooth running of the day. If you have any questions, just ask them. That's what we're here to do. If in the event of, unlikely event, hopefully, of any emergency, for any of us in the chapel, we will be leading people out to the courtyard, to the assembly point. For those of you in the audiovisual, you'll be taken out to the front door of the house, to the front entrance. There's an assembly point there. Now, I would also mention the refreshments will be served in the tea room at, let me see, I think it's 11:30, and then lunch will be at 1:30. Lunch vouchers are available for €10 for a light lunch. During lunchtime, we will run 2 highlight tours of the house, short tours. So if anyone has not been into the house before, or anyone wants to come back again, we will take you through, and it'll relieve a little bit of pressure on the tea room. And then if anyone is around next week, first Wednesday of every month is free admission to all OPW sites throughout the country. It's part of an initiative to kind of encourage people in to visit. And also we now have free admission for under 12s to our sites. So hopefully tell your friends and to avail of that. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Ruth, and hope you have an enjoyable day.
Adrian, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to you and your colleagues for facilitating the summer school again in this wonderful venue of Derrynane House and grounds. Our topic this morning that we're going to explore is O'Connell's Kerry. Now, Maurice, in his opening remarks at the summer school yesterday in Cahersiveen, referred to the fact that despite the apparent remoteness of this part of the world, the depth and strength of the connections between Kerry and the people of Kerry and the wider world were always strong. The people here knew more about what was going on in Paris, Rome, Vienna than they did in Dublin. So this part of the world has always been in touch, knowing what's going on, and part of wider world events. And today we'll be exploring in a bit more detail the nature of the world in which O'Connell was born, the kinds of issues around travel, which still exist for those of us that come and go. And we'll also be looking at the big house, the history of the big house in Kerry. So we have a very exciting and I think very novel presentations from our three speakers. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Maiveen Ní Urdáil, who is Associate Professor of Irish in UCD, and she has published on scribes in Ireland in the 17th and 18th century, and has also published a book about the story of the Battle of Clontarf as transmitted through generations of scribes. She is an authority on the literary and manuscript tradition of Munster. And she's going to talk to us, the theme of her talk to us this morning is Gaelic South Kerry in the 18th century. So Maiveen, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Before I begin, I would just like to thank the organising committee for the invitation to be part of this very exciting project and programme. And it's an honour and a privilege to be here in this wonderful part of the country. South Kerry looms large in 18th century Gaelic Ireland. And what I want to do here this morning is to mention in brief two women who have contributed greatly to this area's literary legacy. I'll begin with Máire Ní Dhronnchadh, grandmother of Daniel O'Connell, whose memory lives on strongly in South Kerry's oral tradition. Of the folklore connected with her, about 40 references appear in the archives of the National Folklore Collection at University College Dublin. She also features in the extensive repertoire of stories of Sean O'Connell, the famous Ivráthach storyteller from Kilrealig, who was born in 1853 and died in 1931. In O'Connell's stories, Máire Ní Dhronnchadh is portrayed as an insightful woman whose turn of phrase was both quick, shrewd, and sharp to the point of being sarcastic at times. Being of noble Gaelic stock, O'Donoghue Dubh of Glenflesk, Máire Ní Dhronnchadh moved to Derrynane following her marriage to Donal Moore O'Connell. And in one anecdote by our storyteller, Sean O'Connell, which I give here in translation, we encounter a formidable woman who rose with ease to her task as mistress of Derrynane House. Máire Ní Dhronnchadh had a servant boy long ago who used to draw loads with a horse. A pebble got into his shoe, and it was hurting his foot inside the shoe. When he stopped work in the evening and took off his shoe, he said to Máire Ní Dhronnchadh he had had a pebble in his shoe all day and his foot was sore. "Why didn't you take off your shoe and take out the stone?" "I thought it would delay me, mistress." She didn't do a thing, but rise and give him his wages. "So," she said to him, "if a stone got in the horse's back, one could hardly say you'd take it out, since you didn't take one out of your own foot." So clearly then, a witty, independent, no-nonsense woman, Máire Ní Dhronnchadh didn't tolerate laziness in her servants and could admonish them accordingly. Another of Sean O'Connell's stories confirms this woman's reputation, again in translation. We used to hear that 3 men were shoveling potatoes for Máire Ní Dhronnchadh. 2 of them had big shovels, and the other man had a very small shovel. It was porridge they got for breakfast, and Máire told the girl to give big spoons to the 2 who had big shovels and a little spoon to the man who had the small shovel. Wait for it. She herself came to watch them when they were eating the porridge. The man with the small spoon would have 2 mouthfuls eaten before the other 2 had finished 1 spoonful. When they went out, she watched them in the field, and she told the girl to give a big spoon to the man who had the small spoon earlier when they were called into dinner. She said that he had eaten 2 spoonfuls to a spoonful by the other 2, and that he had shoveled 2 shovelfuls of earth to 1 by the other 2. It was hard to deceive Moira. But Jokur dul the voide. Moira Ní Dhuibh was also known as a competent poet in her own right, and numerous examples of quatrains and sarcastic responses in verse form part of the oral tradition connected with her in the Iveragh Peninsula. She was reputed to have the gift of prophecy, and her satirical powers were feared by many. Unusually for women generally, apart of course from her daughter, Eileen Dubhnaí Chonaill, Moira also features in Irish scribal tradition. Copies of a poem composed on the birth of the Liberator, for example, have come down to us in 2 19th century Gaelic manuscripts, and one of these informs us that it was composed extempore by his grandmother, Moira Ní Dhuibh herself, at his birth on the 12th of May 1775. In translation, the poem reads as follows: "Come to life, young Daniel, you've brought to us happiness and prosperity. A boat laden with great salmon and a herring boat coincide with your arrival. The oven's fuel is burning now, and women are sieving meal to a fineness. Other women about the business of churning, making a plentiful supply of butter. To you and to us, great prosperity will come. It is a prophecy that may come to pass. Since everybody did well in their business today, you'll prosper and never be in want of food and drink." Predictably then, O'Connell is the hero whose birth coincides with prosperity and plenty. Of Moira Ní Dhuibh's children, she had, it seems, 22 in all, Eileen Dubhnaí Chonaill is credited with what is arguably one of the most famous poems in the Irish language in the modern era. Cuoine Artí Léide, or Lament for Art Ó Léide, concerns the death of her husband, Art Ó Léide, who was shot dead on the 4th of May, 1773, near Corriganime, County Cork. The poem itself survives in no manuscript contemporary with the shocking event it describes, and its 2 longest versions are much later, having been written down from the recital of Nora Ní Hindle, or Norrie Singleton, a well-known Keening woman, or Ban Chinte, from near Mill Street, County Cork, who died about 1870. The earliest of Ní Hindle's versions, first written down about the year 1800, was published by Sean O'Tuama in 1961, an edition which will be probably familiar with many of you here today. Ní Hindle's later version of Cuoine Artí Léide is present in a manuscript kept today in UCD Library's special collections. It was written by Pádraig Fertair, or Patrick Ferreter, originally from the Corcorína Gaeltacht, who emigrated to the US in 1894 and who eventually settled in New York, where he spent most of the remaining years of his life. Ferreter copied this later version of Cuoine Artí Léide from a manuscript, now lost, that he had on loan from Daniel McCabe, a scribe of Bantir, County Cork. He finished his transcription on the 1st of April 1894 and added a number of lines to it, which he had heard in Corcorína in September 1893 from his kinswoman Máiread Ní Ionagáin, or Margaret Finnegan. Ferreter subsequently published the text, together with explanatory notes, in 3 issues of An Gael, New York's bilingual monthly periodical dedicated to the Irish language. The later version has since been republished, along with a fine translation into English by Angela Burke in Volume 4 of the Field Day Anthology of Irish Writing, which was published in 2002. And I should add here that in extracts that I will cite from the poem in translation, I'm indebted to Angela's work on that. The subject of this Cuoine, Art Ó Léide of Macroom, County Cork, had in real life clashed with his neighbour, Abraham Morris, formerly a magistrate, and their contention ultimately led to Ó Léide being shot. The reasons for their mutual dislike are not clear, but they probably reflect a deeper contention between 2 opposing communities, propertied Catholics and Protestants in southwest Cork. And as an aside, I should say that the O'Learys and the O'Sullivans were the only propertied Catholics in West Cork, while in its little towns, Skibbereen, Bantry, Baltimore, Bandon and Dunmanway, they were mainly Protestant. The O'Learys and the O'Sullivans also married into County Kerry, notably into the O'Connells of Ivrohach, and the marriage of Eileen Dove to Art O'Leary in 1767 very much accords with this pattern. Be that as it may, on his return from service in the Austro-Hungarian armies in the 1760s, the youthful Arth soon garnered a reputation for recklessly challenging the local establishment, and notices of complaints against him were placed in the public press, notably in the Cork Evening Post. Demands subsequently made of him by Abraham Morris included that he sell his horse in accordance with the 1695 penal law, which required a Roman Catholic to sell a horse if offered £5 5 shillings by a magistrate. Tensions came to a head when O'Leary's plan to ambush his foe was discovered, and he was killed by a military detachment gathered by Morris, with the former magistrate later acquitted of the murder. Now, its historical context aside, Cuina Arti Leire, which contains almost 400 lines in the edited versions, draws heavily on themes which are common in earlier laments in Irish. These include, for example, the keening woman addressing the dead man directly, and this in terms of love and affection. So from the outset, Eileen Dove conveys her unwavering love for her husband, as well as the quality of their life together as a married couple, and this she does by a litany of terms. Mogra godangen to, machara godangen to, machara hus godangen, macharas magaun to, machara hus mahark, machara hus mahark ween, mogra hus mochoman, etc. I should add that murmured lines like these are typical in the Irish keening tradition generally. The chief lamenter murmurs repeatedly to herself before building up, as it were, to a crescendo in unloading bouts of intolerable grief. Eileen Dove poignantly describes how well her husband provided for her, and she supplies concrete details about the beauty of their house in Raleigh near Macroom, as well as the quality of the food they enjoyed and the luxury of being attended to by servants. De chudish pordlus da yalagum, shomeri da nglanagum, bakus da yaragum, brik da kapagum, roast da vrakagum, rere is glakagum, boord da lahagum, muka da vadagum, mana finnig rantagum, mana glak lastergum, kolle igloov lachenrum, gediach an tadarha no harish da danachlum. You had a parlour whitewashed and bedrooms cleaned for me, an oven heated for me, bread was made for me, and meat was roasted. Managing your household, I had tables spread for me, wine drawn for me, beef slaughtered for me, pigs butchered for me, women to knead for me, women to pour for me. I could sleep and duck down until mid-morning, or later if I wanted to. We find another theme, common to the lament in Irish generally, in the following passage, where Eileen Dove asks her husband to rise up as if he were still alive. Mogra hu godangen is eirig soasit hasav, agus tarlub féin a bhaile, go gudhid mart da lega, go gudimid rós da vraka, go gudimid trianta da leha, go ngleif mar chósir arsing, go meg agin ceol da spiraga, go goiród fút laba, fré vratach a bblion de gala, agus fé chultna brethe brecha, a bhuinig asad alles in unad an uachtach lakish. Dear love indeed, now rise up on your feet and come back home with me and let us slaughter beef and roast a joint of meat and spread a great feast for a retinue of guests. We'll have musicians play, and I'll make you a bed with white linen sheets and fine patchwork quilts that will make you sweat with heat instead of this awful cold. We have here too, of course, in this passage, the woman's clear denial that her beloved is gone and the first stage in her grieving process. Other themes belonging to the lament in Irish and echoed in Cuina Arti Leire include the heroic traits of the dead man. Eileen Dove boasts of her husband's elegant appearance and attire, his noble ancestry and his generosity. Proud of his virtues as a husband, she is prouder still of his virtues as a man. Ma chara go daingantó is bra hí a chatadait fé bhaunda dór haranghe agus clíomh cín erigid, cus céim valarach ag achcail cananfút, dúlaí dí sasannig síos go talamhdait agus ní ar bhatheleat ach le héan chorp agala cé gur leo a chailftó. Dear firm friend, you looked well in a hat, with a band of gold around it, a silver-hilted sword and the proud high step of your white-blazed horse. The English would bow down to the ground to you, not out of love for you, but because of fear of you, and yet through them you died. Other themes in the poem, common with the Irish lament generally, include the community's overall sorrow as reflected in nature, as well as the Keening woman's curse on those who caused the death of her subject. We are told in graphic terms how Art's wife learned of his death when his horse returned home bloody and riderless, following which she hastens to the place where he died, stretched out like a slain animal, with only the corner of an old woman's cloak as a covering and nobody to lament him. Machara gadangan agus níor chredis riamh de bharmh gur hánig chum de chapel agus fuil de chríar a lachan siar go díalat hiranta mar a mítad híos at hasaf. Hugus léim go táisig an tarna léim go gata agus an tío léim ar ma chapel. De lús agus de skradas, de bhuilas go lua ma vasa, de bhuinas as na rahef, chom maith agus de bhí sé agam. Go bhuiris róm tú marv, mar a bheith bón ó capel, fé hár hirín atin, gan pápa gan aspag, gan cléirech gan sagart, a léfachart an talim, ach seanavan chrían na chatte, a lahart bín da falling. Dear firm friend, I didn't credit your death till your mare came back streaked with your heart's blood from her cheek to your tooled leather saddle, where you rode astride and standing. I took one leap to the doorstep and a second to the gate and the third up on her back. I yelled and I screamed and beat my hands together and pressed the mare to gallop as fast as she could travel till I found you lying dead like a cow or a horse beneath a clump of firs with no pope or bishop, no clerk, no priest who could read a psalm above you, just a weary old woman who had spread her cloak across you. This passage contains two striking themes associated with the Keening woman, or Ban Chainte in Irish sources, namely the beating of her hands together, the Bhuilas go lua mavasa, and taking 3 leaps, where she talks about Hugus leim go táirsigh and tarna leim agus tío leim, etc. So that latter motif of the 3 leaps is a stylized action which recalls the quintessential Galt, or madman, most notably Sivna Galt, or Mad Sweeney. Eileen Dove conveys her profound wish that she had been by her husband's side as the bullets pierced him, and she bitterly denounces the man believed to have been bribed into betraying him. Grada crí cruigart de chean vac wenne, mas brabba vi wetse, nar hanig fam huerim, go dúrhin det moorchid, kapel rogacha, a yenach tú ódach chís na sloitiv, an lába chrogit, nu macha bra boivdet, nu kire bre oandrit, nu talav chan tuere, nu clo le moon gal de hinach swaslum, gid gur voor an trúlum I de wehhuasart mar closhim da lochint, gur budde hin fuelto, femar beholdit. My heart's hard curse on you, Sean McWenhe. If a bribe was what you wanted, you could have asked me. I'd have given you the lot, the heavy-maned horses to carry you safely through crowds of people when you had to get out, or a fine field of horses, or ewes all in lamb, or a green to bleach linen, or a suit of my darlings who used to lie down with me, however much it pained me to see you wear it, for I hear it said, you're a wretched specimen, which is what I'd expect. Eileen Dove's anger as expressed here gives way to a third stage in the grieving process, that which we might call the bargaining phase. Being more introspective and involving the lamenter to focus on herself and on her inaction in the face of death, she begins to bargain with death and imagines a different outcome had she only been present. Queen Artí also captures the fragmentation, disintegration and chaos which followed Artó death. Eileen Dove imagines the impact on their children, for example. The 2 eldest will have no father to answer them when they call, and their mother, overwhelmed with grief, is unlikely to give birth to the 3rd child she is carrying. We find the poem emphasising the traumatic impact of Arthur Léda's death on a family doomed for disintegration, with Eileen Dove prepared to leave the homestead desolate while she herself remains destitute in pursuit of justice. One of the best known and indeed striking themes of the Irish lament is the drinking of the dead man's blood, and we have numerous examples of this in Irish tradition going back to texts which were originally compiled in the early Irish period, that is pre-1200. Now, this motif also occurs in the version that was edited by Angela. It doesn't occur in the edition, in Seán Thomas' edition. And we have similar examples of this by wailing women in Irish saga literature. I'm thinking here of Eivor, for instance, the wife of Cuchulainn, and Deirdre, who lamented the sons of Uisnech. And this particular motif seems to me at least, to be confined to the Gaelic world of Ireland and Scotland. So to conclude, as to the overall enduring legacy of this lament, apart altogether from the fact that it circulated widely, as well as the fact that it is informed by a highly politicised tragedy, Caoine Arty Léide also captures a decisive time in Ireland when, from the mid-1760s onwards, a new sense that Catholics could be assertive was in the air. Added to this, of course, is the fact that extracts of the lament have been repeatedly included in collections of Irish language poetry for the school syllabus, and translations by Frank O'Connor, Eilish Dillon, Thomas Kinsella, John Montague, and Angela Burke have made it familiar to a wider audience of readers. And given our location here today, we shouldn't forget Eileen Dove's own family connections as aunt of Daniel O'Connell, one of Ireland's most celebrated public figures in the 19th century, which I think would surely have ensured a particular enduring interest in the poem. Caoine Arty Léide still continues to grip the imagination in new forms of expression. Peadar Ó Riada of Cooley adapted it to music in 2003, and its premiere performance by Cór Van Cooley took place in Ballyvourne in April of that year. A CD of Ó Riada's work was also launched in 2004, also in Ballyvourne, by Cathal Gowan, who was then Director General of RTE. A number of documentaries on the poem have been televised in recent years, while an Irish language documentary, Caoine Arty Léide, is available on YouTube. At its heart, of course, is a great love story, conveyed through the raw grief of Eileen Dubhney Chunnell, a grief this woman from South Kerry expressed freely and powerfully through the medium probably most naturally associated with women in Irish language tradition, namely the oral lament. And what a fine exponent of the lament tradition, possibly the finest, Caoine Arty Léide truly is. Thank you.
Maiveen, thank you so much for a fascinating insight into a very important poem in our Gaelic tradition, and perhaps suggesting from where Daniel O'Connell got his great way with words. He's certainly part of the family tradition. I'm going to hold questions until all our speakers have made their presentations. And then I'll invite questions from the floor in the oratory first. Then we'll go to the AV room, and then we'll invite questions from the marquee outside, so that everybody will get a chance to pose a question to the speakers. So let's move on, and I'll introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. John Knightley. John works in the Department of Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht. He's from Killorglin, and has a great interest in the history of his native Kerry, especially in the role and influence of the Godfrey family, and in the role of the big houses in Kerry. So something I think we all can learn a bit more about. So over to you, John.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak to you this morning about the role of the big house in Kerry. In particular, one particular house that has strong connections actually with the O'Connell family. Now, we are discussing many things at this conference. You've heard about Gaelic South Kerry. We're going to be talking about women and O'Connellite politics. So my topic is going to be quite different. It's very much on the visual or the material world of a Catholic big house that was constructed and built during the period of O'Connell, and of which we know very little about, or which the general population of Kerry know very little about. So I hope through the course of this conversation to give you an insight into the world of a family who came to Kerry in the early 19th century and built this extraordinary castle outside Killarney. Now, much has been written about the Anglo-Irish and the Protestant big house, but little about their Catholic counterparts, certainly in Kerry. So I hope to shed some light on this topic today. So this is a very visual display, so you need to keep your eye on the monitor here to kind of get a sense what I'll be talking about. This panoramic view of Killarney was done in 1836. And it reveals very much how Killarney was the centre of Catholic influence in Kerry, as opposed to Tralee, which was traditionally more Protestant. Doubtless the power and wealth of the Kilmare family had much to do with it, but a cursory look of many of the names of the owners of these houses reveals a strong Catholic gentry network around Killarney. So for instance, you have the Cronins, Mahonys, O'Connells, Curtains, Leahys, O'Donohues, O'Sullivans, McCarthys. Towering over them all on the far left-hand corner is Coastman's Castle, also known as Flesk or Glenflesk Castle. And it is this castle I'm going to talk to you about today. If you had visited Killarney before 1818, you would not have seen this castle. If you see the hill there in the middle of the image, you'll see a little house on top of it. That's Drumhumper Hill. If you know Killarney, Drumhumper Hill is located behind the Brehon and Gleneagle Hotel. On top of Drumhumper Hill was a lodge belonging to the Herbert family of Muckross. It was a tower-like structure with 2 single rooms on each side. And it was set within an ancient ring fort, and you can actually see the ring fort in the image. That was 1807. If you had visited Killarney 20 or so years later, what you would have seen was a quite different image. You would have seen, not only from the approach road from Macroom at Moor, but also from anywhere around the lakes and from Killarney town itself, this extraordinary silhouette of turrets, towers, battlements, archways, surrounded by plantations of trees, oak, fir, seemingly impregnable and ancient, but in fact completely an illusion. A modern building that had been built, masquerading as a castle that had been built within the previous 15 years. For over 100 years, this castle dominated the landscape of Killarney, yet today its history is all but forgotten. So therefore, who was the family responsible for this extraordinary building? Well, the man who built it was an Irishman, seen here on the left, John Coastman, who tentative evidence suggests he had roots in Cork. Sometime in the 1770s, he'd moved to Portugal, taking up residence in Lisbon. He made a fortune from importing wine and cotton from Iberia and South America into Britain during the revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. And he was part of a circle of very influential Irish-Portuguese merchant families. Others included the Shays, Murrows, Stacks, Barrys, Goulds, Galways, all influential figures in Lisbon. His wife, Christina, shown here on the right, was half French, half Irish. Her mother was a Shay, with, I think, Kerry roots. Her father was a de l'Essence, a noble man from Liège. They had 3 children, all born in Lisbon. With the growing threat of the Napoleonic invasion of Iberia, the family moved to London in 1805, and they quickly became part of a very influential circle of middle-class Catholics. And they were gradually drawn into the Irish Catholic circles, and surviving correspondence clearly shows that they were good friends in inverted commas, with Lord Kilmare and that circle. This close relationship was solidified, I suppose, in 1814, when their eldest daughter, Christine, married Daniel Cronin of the Park, Killarney. Now, the Cronins of the Park were very influential middlemen, extremely rose up through the ranks and became landed gentry by the early 19th century. So this marriage with one of the Cronins introduced the Coastman family to Kerry, and of course, through the Cronins, they were actually now related to the Liberator himself. Visiting Killarney for the first time in 1815, John Coastman became enamoured with the views. And he decided, and it's also the essentially Catholic respectability that permeated local society, which was very appealing. So in 1816, he bought Drumhumpra Hill from the Herbert family, and he used their lodge basically as a summer retreat on visits from London. Now, the lodge was damaged by fire in 1818 and again in 1823. And this gave the impetus to rebuild it in what was called the popular Gothic revival style in the form of a castle. Now, there was two kind of reasons behind this. A castle would symbolize the wealth and aspirations of this nouveau riche mercantile family who were seeking to integrate themselves into county society. And of course, it was also represented a very potent symbol of rising Catholic power and influence. Indeed, it is one of the most striking Catholic buildings built in Kerry before the wave of churches built by the Catholic Church in the later 19th century. It has been suggested that the core of the house was designed by Sir Thomas Deane of Cork, and indeed the core of the castle, as you can see here, bears a striking resemblance to that. However, it would appear that Coastman himself was largely responsible for building the building with the help of a very unknown Kerry-based architect, James Chambers of Tralee, who operated during this period. And numerous letters referred to Chambers working on the castle. It is clear that they borrowed from other Kerry houses. You see here on the left, Belly High Castle, and here at the doorway to Flesk Castle, and you can see the similarities, buttresses, cruciform openings, and so on. They also borrowed examples from Drumore Castle, close to here. So the castle was built in stages over a period of about 15 to 20 years. So it's a mishmash of different styles, different influences. It's built in different levels and different heights. And what is quite interesting about it, and which is probably unique, certainly to Kerry and to Ireland, is they hand-tinted the plaster that was applied to the walls. So when you were looking at it from a distance, it looked like the castle was made of different stone. And that actually still survives to this day, which is quite extraordinary. So in many respects, it's a hybrid building. This plan here gives you a good indication. So the bit highlighted in red shows you the original lodge, owned by the Herberts. Then the castle expanded north in the blue and east in the grey around a large courtyard. All this took place in the 1820s and 1830s, but the building itself wasn't actually only finished until the 1840s. This piecemeal construction meant it was never actually finished, or never actually grand in the large scale like other country houses. So, for example, there was never a grand staircase or anything like that. They may do with a circular staircase in one of the towers. The defining feature of the interior was the grand hall, and it was 30 feet wide, 30 feet high, and there was a gallery that ran three sides around it. In typical 18th century style, there was a grand enfilade of rooms or progression of rooms. You came into the hall, you then progressed into the antechamber, then into the octagon room. You then proceeded to the small drawing room, grand drawing room, and you terminate in the dining room. All these rooms were richly decorated in the Gothic style with oak doors, oak paneling, and heavily gilded ceilings. This is an image of the west facade of the castle. And you can see there on the ground floor the grand enfilade rooms. You can see the battlements replicated in the hedge. And above on the first floor, there was a state bedroom reserved for important guests with a boudoir or dressing room beside it and other smaller bedrooms along. As you progress across the building, on the far right of the photograph, you see an octagon tower. That was the servants' quarters. And there was a tiny, smaller tower there's a spiral staircase inside it which gave access. And the servants' quarters are absolutely tiny compared to the grand staterooms downstairs. What is quite interesting about the castle is when it was built, it used the latest technology. So there was actually a cistern in the roof, and there was a series of pumps that pumped the water around the castle. And you can still to this day see the leaded pipes embedded in the walls. There was also a boiler set up in the laundry to wash and steam clothes. And there was a brewing house, very important, for brewing beer. And there was an elaborate malting apparatus installed. So it had all the latest mod cons for the time. What is quite fascinating is, by the way, you can see here the hand-tinted brickwork on the circular tower, which gives the impression of different types of brick, but it's actually only plaster. What is quite fascinating about this building is that it gives us a great insight into how a big house it was constructed in Kerry in the 1830s. I think it's the only record we have. So, for example, we know that the ornate chimney pieces on the ground floor were ordered from a Mr. Sweeney of Cork. Looney of Tralee supplied less ornate chimney pieces for the upper floors. Coleman of Cork, cabinet maker, supplied the oak furniture for the hall. The family imported furniture from France and statues from Italy. Heavy wool and damask was ordered from London because it was considered the best quality for curtains and for curtains over the doors. Because the castle was on top of the hill, and you can imagine how drafty it must have been. What is quite interesting in the account books is it was a household, Catholic household in all respects. All the servants were Catholic. The steward was one Tim Favey from Killarney. His wife Bridget was the housekeeper. One Jack Leary was the maintenance man whose main job was repairing leaks to the roof. Anne Hennessy looked after the fowl in the pigeon loft, and a Thomas Dawley managed the stables. And quite interesting, as part of their wages, they were given salted beef of middling quality and plenty of cabbage. Now, the expansion of the castle reflected the desire by the Coastmans to establish themselves very much as part of Kerry society, especially after the death of John Coastman Sr., who died in 1835, and the castle was then inherited by his son, shown here on the left. Now, this John Coastman is quite an interesting character. His nickname amongst his friends was the Kerry Pippin. He had quite a ruddy complexion, and it was due to great love and ability to imbibe lots of alcohol. He was educated by the Jesuits in Lisbon and England, and in many respects he was a typical Regency dandy. He spent much of his youth, for example, roaming Europe on the lookout for a wealthy Catholic bride and spending his father's money. In terms of politics, his most notable attribute was he was strongly anti-tithe, saying on one occasion, "This odious tax on the industry of the most wretched people, most wretched peasantry on the face of the earth." So he's quite vocal in terms of promoting anti-tithe discontent. During the 1830s, he was away for most of this time. The castle was inhabited by his sister, shown here on the left. Now, she had married Sir William Duncan Godfrey of Milltown in 1824, which was a strategic alliance on many levels. She brought £10,000 to the Godfrey family, and the Godfreys brought them respectability within the county. Interestingly enough, that marriage was caused quite a bit of drama at the time. The couple had eloped and eventually had to marry 3 times, in a Catholic ceremony, a Protestant ceremony, and a civil ceremony, just to be 100% sure the marriage was legal. Despite this advantageous connection, John Coastman was always conscious of his newcomer status within Kerry. He bemoaned being denied the position of Deputy Lieutenant by the county by Lord Kinmare, and the opportunity, and this was the most important aspect, the opportunity to wear a scarlet livery in society, or even better still at a ball in Turin, Rome, or Naples. What is quite interesting about them is they rarely spent much time in Kerry, having built this massive castle. Theirs was an international world, and Paris was their home away from home, and they, in fact, spent 3 to 5 months of every year living in Paris. Letters from Paris mention other Kerry families in Paris during this period, such as the O'Connells, the Mahonys, the Cronins, Lord Headley, and of course Lord and Lady Kinmare, which were the figures, the top figures of the society. In fact, on one occasion, John Coastman procured an expensive box at the Italian Opera in Paris for Lady Kinmare, which she then declined, much to his disgust. The family moved in legitimate circles, and they were unsympathetic to the citizen king, Louis Philippe, the so-called king of the French, and all their connections were with Ancien Regime nobility, or new Napoleonic. So, for example, here on the left, you have Jean-Pierre de Baron de Castellan. He was married to one first cousin. He was a Napoleonic officer who distinguished himself in various battles. He served in the Garde Impériale, also served in the Royal Guard under the Bourbon Restoration, but then fell out of favour under the Orléans regime. He was a Knight of the Legion d'Honneur and also Chevalier of St. Louis. So the family were quite well connected. More significantly, however, is the relationship with the Duke de Duras. Their first cousin was married to this man. She was his second wife. And this gave the family entree to the highest levels of French society. The Duke was gentleman of the bedchamber to Louis XVI, XVIII, and Charles X. And the family had a quite extraordinary salon, right-wing salon in Paris, and which the Coastmans and their like frequented. So kind of these relationships give you a sense of the flavour of the kind of world they lived in when they lived in Paris. And Versailles and salons and everything are sprinkled throughout their letters, so it's quite an extraordinary world that they lived in. While abroad, all the works from Flesk were implemented by John Coastman's brother-in-law, Sir William Duncan Godfrey, and this included laying out an extraordinary domain around the house, which was 160 acres, typical parkland setting. if you see there the black line on the screen, that was the original avenue to the house, which then was later changed because Lady Kenmare was afraid of falling into Flesk River. The avenue was diverted to the other side of the castle. There was various stages in this throughout the 1830s. There was a farmyard built. You can see it kind of in the middle of the screen with a walled garden in 1830. There was oak wood planted in 1834. New belts along the river planted in 1836. What's quite interesting is when you see who they bought the trees from, and it was mostly from Lord Kenmare's nursery in Killarney. And how cheap, well, to my mind, how cheap it appeared. For example, in 1829, they bought 12,000 larch saplings for £12 from Lord Kenmare's nursery. And what's also quite interesting is the plants they send from abroad. For example, various species of clematis, which were brand new at the time, Virginia creeper, and carnations. So wherever they traveled throughout Europe, they would send back seeds to the castle. This aerial shot then gives you a very good idea of the landscape around the castle. And the most notable feature of this is the Grand Ha-Ha wall, which runs in a circle around the front of the castle here. Now, for those of you who don't know what a ha-ha is, it basically is a wall that is built to protect the approach to the castle itself, the surrounds of the castle from animals. So when you're looking out the front door, you don't see the wall because it blends into the landscape, but when you're approaching it, you can see it clearly. Between the castle and the ha-ha wall was what was called the clover lawn. And the Coastmans introduced one of what was called the first lawnmowers, I suppose, the handheld rolling lawnmowers, into Kerry in the 1820s to keep this lawn perfectly smooth, pretty much like a modern lawn is kept today. So they were, as I say, they were quite advanced in terms of what they were doing. You'll also notice in this image the Creelta planting, which was planted in the 1960s and 70s, which blocks the castle nowadays from being seen from Killarney. But you can see the broadleaf planting there as well, which gives you an indication of some of the original plantations. Now, I have visited this landscape quite a number of times, and what is quite clear is it is an extremely important, very important, late Regency period domain landscape in the manner of Humphrey Repton, with hidden pathways, gardens, and landscape features surrounding the castle. But of course, as in typical Irish fashion, it is completely unprotected, which is quite sad. This is an image of the ha-ha wall, which again you can see that this is about 6 feet high, and just to protect the approach to the castle from animals. What is quite interesting as well from the castle, this is a view from one of the turrets taken in the 1930s. The castle and domain borrowed fully from the dramatic landscape surrounding it, much more comprehensively than either Muckross or indeed the various residences made by the Kenmare family. It is one of the most successful picturesque compositions you will find in the south of Ireland. These are a series of sketches by John Coastman's nephew, John Fermor Godfrey, and I think they kind of bring home the kind of rather decadent life that they lived at the time. Returning briefly to the Coastmans, he returned to Kerry in 1844 with a Catholic English bride. He continued to live a rather decadent life with the townhouse in Dublin, the castle here in Kerry, summer house in Rossbay, and occasional visits to Paris. At Flesk, he paid host to numerous characters prominent in Kerry society, many of them connected with Daniel O'Connell. It was a world dominated by the hunt, by dinners, by politics, and by networking. Regular visitors to the castle included John Shea Lawler, who was married to one of the O'Donohues of Dunloe. Another frequent visitor was John O'Connell, the Liberator's brother. And O'Connell was actually often trusted with bringing post and gifts from Paris and London back to Killarney. For example, in 1831, he had to bring 2 yards of silk for Mary Theresa, who wanted a new scarf. Another frequent visitor was Thomas Collins Dumas, solicitor in Killarney. Of course, he was a friend of O'Connell's. And more significantly, Pierce Mahony, Daniel O'Connell's solicitor, was a very frequent visitor to this castle because he was also John Coastman's solicitor. Mahony, of course, as you know, played an important part in the campaign for Catholic emancipation and in the defence of O'Connell in the state trials of 1843-44. And John Coastman publicly and privately subscribed heavily to these various campaigns. After Catholic emancipation, John Coastman's brother-in-law, Daniel Cronin, was the first Catholic High Sheriff of Kerry. Coastman himself served as High Sheriff in 1843, a role he despised, but he did like dressing up in the very elaborate uniform. So moving on swiftly, dinners at Flesk were very lengthy and lavish. The wine cellar was the same size as the dining room, and the dining room was the same size as this room, so that gives you an indication. Coastman wrote on one occasion, Lord Headley did me the honour of dining with me on Sunday. I had a grand lot out, having asked the O'Connells, O'Donoghue and Morrow, Coxon, Shea Lawler, Dan Cronin and Howley. We had a mighty fine time. So one can just imagine what a fine time they had. During the famine, he won many plaudits and praise for his extensive relief measures around Killarney, and according to family legend, his death in 1849 was due to overexertion on behalf of the famine, during the famine. So his death basically ends the story of this really interesting family, mercantile, Irish, Catholic, international, liberal, legitimist, philanthropic, extravagant. The castle that they built, and this is an important point, was not the creation of an Anglo-Irish mindset. It borrowed from it, certainly, but it represented much more. It rightly can be seen as a symbol of Catholic aspirations in the early 19th century. And just to terminate quickly, the Coastmans are gone, but the castle lives on. It was inherited after his death by his nephew, who adopted the name Cronin, hence becoming Cronin Coastman. They lived here until 1918. They put a concrete roof on the castle in 1912, which was quite amazing. It was then bought by Jack McLeodcuddy, a brother of the McLeodcuddy of the Reeks. He was an outspoken loyalist. He lived there until 1930. It was after his death it was sold, and basically it was dismantled in 1944. It was bought by the Forestry Commission, gardens planted, and the domain dismembered. It was sold again in 1990, became a ruin effectively, as you can see here, but the fact that it kept its concrete roof meant that actually the building survived. Some 10 years ago it was bought by an Irish-American family, the O'Reillys, who have strong connections to Killarney, and they have commenced works on restoring the castle. They're working from the top down, so they're starting at the roof and working their way down. So you can see here some of the scaffolding and chimneys being repaired. The entire concrete roof has got a new felt cover, and the chimneys and battlements are being rebuilt. So you can see the new roof there, works of the turrets. You can see the scaffolding around the castle. This will ensure its immediate survival until they decide what to do with it in the long term. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, there's a strong possibility that we will yet see the day when this extraordinary fairy tale castle, said to have inspired Bram Stoker actually when writing Dracula, regains its preeminence over Killarney. It is an iconic building. It's part of Kerry's heritage. It's unusual as a Catholic-built house. It's unusual the fact that we have records which describe its building. It's one of the first, if not the first castle, built by a middle-class Catholic family after the penal laws were abolished. It's symbolic, aspirational, yet romantic. It's bold, brash. It was bling for its time. If you compare it to Derrynane, which is much more subdued and romantic, different environment. So we wait and see what the future holds for Flesk Castle. But I hope I've given you a sense of how it was created and constructed during that period. Thank you very much.
John, thank you so much for bringing Flesk Castle to our attention and for bringing to life the construction and the life that went on in the castle, and again emphasising all those connections between that family and the wider world. So thank you very much indeed. And at the risk of overloading Adrian Corcoran and the OPW, I do wonder if the OPW could turn their attention and see in what way could they help preserve that building and the landscape for future for future generations. We're moving on now to our third and last speaker, and I am delighted to introduce Dr. Pat Wallace. Pat is the former director of the National Museum of Ireland. He is a well-known expert on Viking Dublin. In fact, he led the excavation at Wood Quay from 1974 until the early 1980s. He has published a very highly regarded book in 2016 entitled Viking Dublin, The Wood Quay Excavations. And the title of his talk today, and he's focusing on transport in this part of the world, In and Out of Kerry, O'Connell's Travel Arrangements in Context. Pat, over to you.
Good morning. As Pope Francis said, I suppose if Tom Fee was advising him, sadly he's no longer with us, it would be Dis Marie Villerman. Thank you, Chair, for that introduction. For the last number of years, I have been engaged with the history of transport, horse-drawn public transport mainly, in Ireland from about 1700 until 1850, the coming of the railways. And it is a labour of absolute love for me. I have enjoyed every inch of it. I've covered every ounce of the island of Ireland, not least Kerry. And it nearly broke my back, but I've broken its back. And it will be, the first draft of it will be finished by the end of October. And just to give you an idea, this may appear posthumously, but it will contain about 30 chapters. I will deal with roads in one chapter. Roads are actually very well covered by people like John Andrews in Trinity College, and I will deal then with posting by stages. That's the stages at which horses are changed on the road and the positions. And then the nerve centres of the coaching age, hotels get a very large chapter, which I'm currently trying to cut down. The hotels are very important, and so are the horses and the stables. They all get separate chapters. And then, as in our age, in the motor car age, the carriage improvements start with private vehicles. Private motor cars lead to the introduction of technology, the funding of technology, which finishes up and ends up being transferred to buses and ordinary transport. Same thing in the coaching age. Then the stagecoach, the mail coach, wheel cars, that's the low back car of Irish history, the jaunting car, and the long car then, the four-wheeled version of that, possibly invented by Bianconi. And then I go into speeds, accidents, fares, and robberies. And then Dublin. I love Dublin, but I have to say in Kerry, Dublin is the centre of everything. In terms of transport, it is the kind of spearhead through which public transport starts in the island of Ireland. And the post office, the part of the post office in that is enormous, not recognised even by the post office itself. We would not have the present inherited motor road system of Ireland without the incredible work of the post office. It was corrupt, it was nepotistic, the full of nepotism and all of that. We wouldn't have it though. We wouldn't have any of the systems we have, only the wonderful innovations of the post office. And the sense of, it wasn't quite a national or patriotic sense, but there was a sense, even when the post office was run from London, that a letter had to be delivered everywhere within the shortest, in Britain and Ireland, in the shortest possible times. Then I've devoted section to wagons, caravans, day cars, and all the regions of Ireland. Now, the regions are very interesting, and Kerry goes not so much with Limerick, but very much with Cork. And Cork is a very distinctive place. Cork is the only big town in Ireland, the only big place that did not have its transport links with Dublin forged before the post office mail coaches were introduced in 1789. Cork is unusual that way. All the other cities, Cork, it was not that Cork was more isolated, it's that Cork was more self-sufficient, I suspect, as Belfast became. Belfast really becomes hugely important from about 1790 to 1810, and that's when it changed and became a really great place in terms of transport. But it was never that tied to Dublin. There were attempts. Cork is even more remote from Dublin, whereas Limerick, Enniskillen and Derry, funny enough, are linked to Dublin. Places like Longford, all linked to Dublin. Wexford even, which is very difficult to get to, all linked to Dublin. Anyway, Cork, the key to Kerry is Cork. And the mail coach... I know. This is a football protest. And it has no bearing on the history of the transport story of horse-drawn transport in Ireland. But I commend you and I wish you well in future campaigns. The mail coach to Kerry, the first one, the first public transport link with Dublin and the outside world, was from Cork to Killarney. That would be before 1810. And that was very quickly extended from Killarney to Tralee. So Tralee was got at first from Cork and Killarney by mail coach. Then there was also a link by mail coach, separate of course, from Limerick to Tralee. So there was a kind of a pincer movement on Tralee. Tralee was already becoming very much the county capital. And central in all of the story of Kerry and my kind of great regard for it is Castle Island. Castle Island is where the road bifurcates and where all the transport filters in both directions, especially on the Limerick Road. And that really brings me to Daniel O'Connell. Daniel O'Connell probably never took a mail coach, never took a stagecoach, certainly not in his later life. He does talk about his early student days and his early days as a barrister in Dublin, when it took him 5 days to travel by postchaise from Derrynane to Dublin. He talks about that to O'Neill Daunt, his great confidant, who travelled with him in much of his road travel. And if you think of, I think of in your own county here, Dick Spring, who had 2 major accidents while he was a minister, driving like a bullet. No, he not driving, being driven through the countryside to get to the Dáil and the Oireachtas in Dublin. Well, it was the same thing in O'Connell's time, except that the pace wasn't as good. You were doing maximum of about 10 miles an hour. But he had a private coach of his own, but it would have been driven like the hammers of hell. And it would have been driven with a change of horse maybe every 10 miles. So the places like Castle Island, Abbeyfeale, Newcastle West, on into Rathkeale, Adair, Limerick, and on up along to Dublin became centrally important. Horses were the fuel of the age, and there were thousands and thousands of horses. There were also hundreds of vehicles in Ireland at this time. So, by the way, O'Connell enjoyed travelling in this way, and he travelled into his late years. There was no other way. Well, by then, of course, the railways were actively being established in England especially, so he would have enjoyed some railway travel at the end of his life. But he did enjoy, for instance, earlier on, the Munster Circuit, and he talks and writes very well about that and the experience. And his kinswoman ran a guest house, which he praises, but that praise is also borne out by some of the travellers to that part of the Kerry-Cork border. Now, at the end of this time, there probably won't be, I want to tell you about the links of Cahersiveen to Killarney and to Tralee, courtesy of Charles Bianconi. Everyone you meet in Ireland, even Dublin taximen, what are you writing about or what are you researching? I'm writing about stagecoach age in Ireland, the coaching age. Everyone, because of our school system, everyone says, oh, Bianconi. Now, Bianconi is very important, but he's at the very end of a process. He capitalizes on pioneering work of a century before, and it's that century before that really engages me. But nevertheless, Bianconi ran an enormous empire, and he was a great close friend of Daniel O'Connell, twice intermarried with him, with his family rather, and Bianconi's own daughter, Minnie, was his first biographer, his best biographer, and she was married to Daniel O'Connell's nephew. So there's a close link politically. When you think of the transport moguls of our age and their lack of idealism, Well, if you contrast that with Bianconi, who was such a figure in the repeal movement, who bankrolled some of O'Connell's ventures, and who was active in the setting or the trying to set up a university, even though he was run down by Cardinal Newman because of his own lack of formal education, his heart was very much in the right place, and he was an idealistic, patriotic gentleman in the land of his adoption. Now, in 2013, 5 years ago, Jerry Collins, the former MEP who was with us yesterday, distinguished politician, they were having a meal for me because he was on the board. John O'Donoghue had very, very cleverly put Jerry on the board. And Jerry said to me, "What do you do now, Pat?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually trying to write about road transport and all of that." And this is a real politician's remark. He says to me, "Do you know what? I might have something for you." talk about a number one dangling in the wind about 400 yards away. He said, so he told me about a place in Abbeyfield, a hardware shop run by a man called Bat Hartnett. I was in Abbeyfield within days when Jerry told me this, and it exceeded my expectation because Bat Hartnett pulled out from under the counter a brown envelope. Don't forget, Jerry was with me, and I hope this isn't being broadcast on Abbeyfield. Anyway, I certainly wouldn't be talking about any of this information only for Jerry. And he showed me a brown envelope, and inside in that envelope was a copybook which was a record of every vehicle that had pulled up in Abbeyfield between 1834 and 1842. So there is a unique, I suspect, in the world, because these are things normally thrown in the fire. It was compiled by a man called David Leahy. Now, David Leahy's relatives finished up and were involved in the Kansas City Star, the American newspaper, have a tremendous history in America, well worth study. But Daniel Leahy that I'm talking about ran the hotel and the livery stable, the yards with the changes of horses in Abbeyfield. And he also, in 1822, he had been kind of very involved with the Rockite movement, the agrarian subversives, if you want to call them that. And in the Abbeyfield area, they murdered the agent of the Courtney estate in Newcastle West. And Daniel O'Connell got him off in a brilliant legal case, I think in Clonmel Assizes, or anyway, in the south of Limerick. And so they became friends, but I suspect it was a formal relationship from the way O'Connell writes to him. Here's the enormous other side of the story. There are about 800 and something entries in this book. I've looked at each one of them. They're single lines. There's a number of ruled columns. They show the date, the destination, the number of horses, the charge, and it's divided into pounds, shillings, and pence, the name of the client, and the drivers that were being hired. Also, amazingly, it gives the name of each one of the horses. So it is just to me a kind of Book of Kells of the second quarter of the 19th century. Sadly enough, leading up to the period of the Great Famine. But Leahy compiled this. How long we left? 5 minutes. All right. Well, we'll stick with Leahy because I want to. O'Connell. The other side of it, as I said, was that O'Connell wrote to each one of the livery stable keepers on the road to tell them he'd be coming. And but all of those letters, they're only tiny one-liners, will be with you at 12 o'clock, will be with you. That would be all the way up to Dublin, maybe 20 every time, and down as well. And his family would have done the same when they were travelling by horse. And from the letters, we find that O'Connell said to Leahy, I'm calling at 12. I want to make sure my timing coincides with when your staff have had Mass. He's done that more than once. He's very concerned about that. He also, the kind of, you can tell from the number of horses being hired, the kind of vehicle involved. O'Connell rode in what is called a chariot. That would be a non-stagecoach. Stagecoach size, without the top of a stagecoach. That would be for huge amounts of luggage, in O'Connell's case, also strapped onto the back. He would have travelled mostly alone or maybe with one other person. And it was the size of a stagecoach, and usually he needed 4 horses for that, and he was either going down to Castle Island or up to Newcastle West. They were the 2 flanking stage changes that he used. And he said on a couple of occasions he hired out 6 horses but mostly 4. Now the thing is, you can tell the size of vehicle involved when you know the number of vehicles. Most of the hirings were of 2 horses in Abbeyfield, among the 800 ones that we have records for. There were 2 horses being hired. Rarely was 1 horse. Maybe a Protestant clergyman. There were quite a number of those. A lot of army men, a lot of civil servants, a lot of the nobility. So you're taking the lid off a layer of society, the upper class layer, who hired horses and used them in this way. I just want to. Just a second. Yeah, among the other people were Father Matthew, the great Tom Steele, the politician who committed suicide when he heard of Daniel O'Connell's death. People like that, and the Archbishop of Dublin, the Lord Lieutenant, various people like that. And when David Leahy, the proprietor, wasn't interested in who they were, he just wrote stranger from Dublin or newlywed from Clonmel, that kind of thing. No interest. But if it was a politician, he always got it right. There's slightly more traffic. Funny enough, I can't figure this one out mathematically. More traffic, slightly more going to Newcastle West from Kerry than from Limerick and Dublin down to Castle Island. A lot of it is going on to Killarney, some of it to Tralee, and Listowel. It comes into its own in this time, about the 1830s. Listowel is the 3rd most important place, not Rathkeil or any of the Limerick towns. Listowel is the active place. Just want to finish. Oh yeah, didn't realise the time slipped by so fast. But it's worth airing the subject anyway. Just to finish, it is a certain niche of society that is running, that are using private transport like this. Though it does include at the very bottom of that social niche, it does include people like feather merchants and jobbers and people like that. And those are words used in the thing. Just to finish, to give you something to think about over your tea, different social stratum altogether. The people who frequented and patronised Bianconi's services, they were much poorer, lower middle class. The ones I've dealt with are upper class elite. There was a car from between Limerick and Killarney, between Killarney and Cahersliveen from 1836. It was a small car. It was just a 2-wheeler that would take a maximum about 6 passengers. The Limerick Tralee car was a 4-wheeler, so that could take about up to 18, but I suspect more likely 12. The Tralee coach as well is a long story how Bianconi was diddled on that, and he had to run a coach and a car between Limerick and Tralee. Killarney, now here's a very interesting one for those interested in Munster, South Munster history. Why was it that in 1854 Bianconi set up 2 routes from Mallow, one to Killarney, a 2-wheeler, a long journey across country by Rathmore, and the other one from Mallow to Tralee, which would go by Castle Island and Ballydesmond. It's the only time that Ballydesmond is the forgotten town of Munster, really. Nobody, I think there must be a treble PhD in Ballydesmond to try and discover it, bring it back to life, and try and see why did such a place get on in life and so ignored in the historical record and in the cartographic record indeed. So those are the main links. Many of the Kerry links go on in Bianconi's world until the disbandment of his service in 1865. So the main point I'd just like to finish with is how important this discovery in Abbeyfield is, not only for Kerry and Limerick and horse-drawn transport history, but for society at large, for the movement of the army, the movement of clergymen, the movement of the upper classes, the middle class. And one last thing about Daniel O'Connell. People say, there are charges against him on all kinds of levels. Maybe I'm sure if you read Oliver MacDonough's brilliant book on him, which is the definitive book on O'Connell, you can see justification for some of it. But if you were to keep a circus on the road of the scale, quality and quantity and frequency of O'Connell, you would need thousands and thousands of pounds. And, the cost of, say, the 4 horses between Abbeyfield, say, and Castle Island would be about 30, what we'd call 30 shillings. That's just once. And that stage all the way up, all the way down to Dublin, think of the enormity. And then the gratuities for the drivers. There is an illustration, only one that I can see, of O'Connell's own chariot. And that's in Belfast, when in 1841 he was actually run out of town by the then protesting extreme on the Protestant side. That's the only time that there's an illustration of his chariot, and boy, was it capable of speed on that occasion. It certainly needed to be. But one thing, think of how old he was when he was still traveling all these roads at this enormous breakneck speed in the dark. It's like being inside in a barrel. John Wayne and these fellows and John Ford don't give they give a romantic idea of traveling in a stagecoach. You'd be like a ball bearing in a shoebox. You'd be thrown around the place, and it would be quite an ordeal. But I hope I've given you some idea of the challenge facing O'Connell and his contemporaries on this front. Thank you.
Pat, thank you so much for really opening up a whole new vista on O'Connell and the challenges he faced, and for, I suppose, reminding us that Bianconi was the Ryanair of its day, and why the Duke of Wellington was greatly perplexed when the first railways appeared in Britain, because he said, now the lower orders can travel and see the world. And of course they did, and the world has changed irrevocably. Now we have a short period of time for questions, so I'm going to take a few questions here first in the oratory. So if anybody, to our 3 speakers, has anybody got a question they'd like to pose or a comment on what you've heard? Yes, wait, Geraldine? Would you like to wait for the microphone so that everybody outside can hear you?
Sorry, are we on?
Yes.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Ruth. Thank you. I'd like to ask Dr. Wallace if he's still with us. Is he still with us? Dr. Wallace, good morning to you. I just wanted to know, were you aware, bringing you right forward into the 20th century, of something called the Shamrock Coach from Rathkeale to Limerick in 1945? Yeah, which was my husband's father, because of no petrol available anywhere, and I didn't know whether perhaps our audience here knew about it, but it's much more modern, obviously. He got up the Shamrock coach with a guy called Johnny Fennell from Rathkeale, and it was a coach and 4 from Rathkeale to Adair, where they changed horses and put 4 more horses on, like you said, and then to Redhouse Hill in Patrickswell, changed horses, and from there went into Limerick, and the capacity was 12 people on board with a coach and 4, but it was an open landau with 4 grey horses.
It wasn't a coach.
Yes, no, it wasn't a coach
It
coach
was a
as such.
Bianconi long car.
Yes, absolutely.
And,
And it went from there, from Adair into Limerick, where on the first occasion, according to the newspapers, there were 5,000 people who welcomed it into O'Connell Street. And I was just wondering, were you aware of it? You obviously
I
are.
am,
But it
but
does bring it into the 20th century.
In fact, the man that brought that to my attention originally was Dr. Hedeman. He was, are you a relative of his, maybe?
No.
He is a small boy.
That's right.
He was Carmencita Hedeman's husband, God
That's
rest
right,
him.
yes.
But he travelled as a boy from Newcastle, or from Rathkeale, or no, from Adair to Limerick.
From Adair to Limerick. There is quite a lot of photographic evidence in the pub in Adair. If anybody's passing through, they are there on the walls, and it's quite a tale to tell.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just thought you might be interested. Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
very much.
Excuse me.
Thank you, Geraldine. Any other questions from the oratory, or can we move to the AV room? Martin Manser has a question here. Wait for the mic, Martin, because they can't hear you outside. Just here, the gentleman.
Can you say something about road building in the 18th century? I mean, in France you had Trudaine, in Scotland General Wade, Telford and Britain. Can you say something about how roads were built and what they were like in the 18th century?
Yeah, our roads in Ireland were better than we imagine. They've been very well and laudably reported upon by Arthur Young and people like that. There are 4 different types of road, as far as I remember. There's the Grand Jury Road, or the precursor of the Grand Jury Road, which is the county council roads or successors of that. There's the post office roads. But mainly there are the turnpike roads. And the turnpike roads in Ireland are outstanding. They begin, 1729 is the first act, brought you from Dublin down to Kilcullen, down into South Kildare. So our transport, or they were the main roads of the time, and they were the roads here in Kerry, by the way. If you look at Smith's History of Kerry, 1751, the road comes up from Castle Island and along there, about that. That's a modern road when Smith wrote his book. But if you want to read about the roads, there's an outstanding article by John Andrews, the great, great John Andrews of Trinity College, who in 1964 wrote a very good book, a very good summary of the roads, which has never been surpassed. And there's a book now by a man called Broderick on the turnpike roads, published by Con Collins in Cork. It's inclusive, but it's not like Andrews' study. And what else is there? Yeah, there's a book on Alexander Nemo as well. Our roads are better than we think, but then our surfaces are very good. And we have pioneers like Lovell Edgeworth in Longford, who was a road innovator. People say he invented the macadam system. He didn't. Macadam did. But you know the way the Irish always have an answer to Marconi or whoever. No, but he was still a genius, and he's the father of Maria Edgeworth.
Now we're moving to the AV room. Is there anyone in the AV room who'd like to put a question to any of our 3 speakers? I hope you have the microphone.
Now, the marquee.
Now, anyone in the marquee? Any questions from those of you listening in the marquee? I'm not hearing any questions.
Yes, Ruth, we're just going to have a question now.
Oh, you have a question. Good. Thanks, Mary.
I wonder, could you let us know the travel times between, say, Cahersaveen and Dublin? How long did it actually take?
can we just take Cork to Dublin? I'd be more familiar with that because the men of the 18th and 19th centuries weren't just thinking Carasavine. The great hero of the post office mail coaches is a man called John Anderson, the founder really effectively of the town of Fermoy. He was a Cork merchant, a Scotsman. The post office was also run by Scotsmen. He was actually a relative of the Postmaster General. Didn't do him any harm, but he set up the mail coaches 1789 to Belfast and to Cork. Limerick followed very quickly, Galway much later, but now, how many hours did it take? It was about 30 hours originally, as far as I know. They wore it down bit by bit, and I have all the times, and it's a chapter in my book, and you've caught me offside, but as far as I know, they got it down to about 18 hours. And then you on top of that then, when the railway came as far as, the Limerick line, Limerick Cork line, they became, they shortened it all down along. 1848, Limerick is the first city reached by rail from Dublin. But the whole accent, as your question rightly implies, is on speed and comfort. Like now, it's how fast you can get from Neenah to Waterford. That's what it's all about, speed.
I might just add, Pat, that in our family experience, when we started coming down to Kerry in the 1960s, it was an 8-hour trip. You'd set out in the morning and you'd arrive in the early evening with a couple of short stops along the way. It's now 5 hours with one stop. So I wonder what my grandchildren, how fast they'll do it, or if it'll all be virtual reality by then. Now, any other questions from the marquee?
I just have a question for John Knightley about the use of Irish among servants in the big houses. Was it something that was permitted? And would that have had a factor in maybe the less use of Irish in going forward?
Evidence is pretty light on this. I mean, the three families I know quite well would be the Godfreys of Milltown, the Leeson Marshalls of Candafercy, and the Coastmans of Lesk. They're kind of the three families I know the best. Certainly the Godfreys, who were Anglo-Irish Protestant to a certain degree, in their correspondence they will use Irish words. And clearly, when you look at not the top layer, their butler and the housekeeper were usually English, most likely Scottish and Protestant, but the underservants were nearly always Catholic. And you can tell by some surviving letters written by these Catholic servants, they were writing English in an Irish manner, if that makes sense. And the family would have had to have some Irish to communicate with them. And throughout some of the letters, you will find words by the family like Boreen, Slán for Slán of Turf, various local phrases that they would use to describe something, particularly in terms of agriculture. So, for example, if you look at Godfrey leases, they would have words describing bridges or small fields, or the domain maps were all, a lot of them were using Irish words. Now, they were anglicised, but they clearly were Irish. So a lot depended on who the family were corresponding with. I mean, in terms of the Coastmans, what's quite interesting is, you can see through John Coastman's correspondence, he does use Irish words to describe certain things, but usually in a kind of derogatory sense. And he was always complaining about the Irish ways of doing things. What that quite meant, I don't know. I suppose in terms of the Leeson Marshall family, what is quite interesting is that there was a very strong connection with the McCarthy Moore and the O'Donoghue. If you're familiar with Mary Agnes Hickson, books on Kerry, a lot of the stories in those books were narrated by Major Marshall of Candafercy, who was Cromwellian on one side, Elizabethan, but also descended from the great houses of O'Donoghue and McCarthy Moore. And the last of the family, whom I would have known as a child, May Ruth, was a fluent Irish speaker. So she spoke with this really upper-class English accent, but she also spoke fluent Irish. So they had a mixed relationship with the Irish language. But certainly it was quite interesting in terms of the younger generations of the big houses in Kerry in the early 20th centuries. Many of them embraced the Gaelic League. In terms of the Godfreys, the youngest daughter there, she was a member of the Gaelic League, and so was Mary Ruth of Cannafercy. So it's an interesting history that we've not really explored that much, but I think that there's definitely scope there for a lot of research in the topic.
And maybe, have you anything to contribute on this?
Just a comment for Pat, in case I don't see you later, Pat.
Sorry, we're just still on the previous question, so just hold for a second, please.
Just to I concur completely. Just to add as well, of course, that the O'Donoghue's, O'Donoghue Glanfleisce, just to take that family as an example, they themselves not only were very important patrons for scribes in the area, but they themselves, Sheafrey O'Donoghue and Glanamar, for example, is a very renowned 17th century poet, so they actually composed themselves in the Irish language as well. So just to add.
Pat, you have,
just
no,
on
no,
the Irish.
please use the mic because they can't hear you.
Oh,
outside.
they can't hear me now.
Yeah, they can't
Just
hear you.
oh, that,
outside,
yeah. Just on the Irish now, here's one for you actually. The Irish is intriguing. In in David Leahy's livery stable records from Abbeyfield, there isn't one word of Irish in the 40 openings. The horses' names are all English, and this is in in an area that was completely Irish speaking at this time. It's an astonishing fact. And to cap it, many of you will remember Maura de Barra from, she was a newsreader in Tre Gaeilge. She's from Dingle. And her father is a blacksmith, or was in Dingle. And I was hoping, because I had been publishing, or trying to, blacksmith's ledgers. And I said to her, hoping there'd be an Irish ledger in Kerry, of all places, a blacksmith's one. There isn't. And in fact, she told me that as far as she knew, they kept the ledgers, you know, the account books, as Béarla. So that's for you to figure.
Okay, one last question from the Marquis. Did I hear it?
Yeah, just a comment for Pat, in case I don't see him later. When he mentioned Ballydesmond and it being lost.
The mystery of Ballydesmond.
Yeah, it began life as King Williamstown in 1834, but it's because the famous Griffith of the Griffith Valuation, as an engineer, he built a road system through the bogs between Castle Island and through Ballydesmond and onwards. There's an article in the Kerry Journal in the 1970s which will fill you in on the road building of that time.
Okay, good. Okay, and I think coffee is calling, and we're going to bring this session to an end, but not before I thank our speakers for 3 fascinating presentations. And these. And I just wish we'd had more time to explore in more detail. And I'm going to hand over to Mary, who has some important messages for the group. Yep.
Just some housekeeping. Deirdre and all her wonderful team in the tea rooms are going to look after you now. So I'm going to ask the people in the marquee can stay in the marquee, and they will be served their teas and coffees there. So you don't need to move from the marquee. The audio-visual room, I would like if you'd go straight to the tea rooms now, and you'll be looked after first. And the people here in the chapel might go a little slowly, and once as you're in the chapel. So there are disadvantages to everything. Deirdre will be selling, or her team, during the course of the coffee, some lunch vouchers. Now they have a wonderful lunch laid on for the very a small sum of €10. There's a selection of sandwiches, mini quiches, and her wonderful cakes and desserts. So I'd recommend that you pre-buy, because it will speed up the lunch process. So enjoy everything, everyone.